Victoria Ashford snatched the crayon drawing out of Ethan Carter's hands and ripped it in half. Then in half again. She let the pieces flutter down onto the marble floor like garbage right in front of 2,000 people and a live camera feed. "You're just a worker," she laughed. "Get him out of my building." Nobody moved to help him. Nobody said a word. But here's what Victoria Ashford didn't know. The man she just humiliated already owned 74% of everything she'd built her whole life on. And in 90 minutes, the board would prove it. Before we go on, comment below what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. And if you believe a good man always gets his day, subscribe and stay with me to the very end. The security guard put a hand on Ethan Carter's shoulder, and Ethan let him. That was the thing people would remember later when they told the story to each other in break rooms and at kitchen tables. He didn't shove the man away. He didn't shout. He just stood there in the middle of that gleaming ballroom, a 42-year-old warehouse supervisor in a suit that was 10 years out of style, and he bent down slowly to gather up the torn pieces of his daughter's drawing. "Sir, you can't be here," the guard said. He was young. His voice cracked a little. "You need to come with me." "Give me 1 second, son," Ethan said quietly. "Just let me pick these up." The pieces had scattered under a cocktail table. He got down on one knee on the cold marble in front of the wealthiest people in the country, and he reached for the crayon-colored scrap that had his daughter's careful handwriting on it. "For Daddy. You are the strongest. Love, Lily." She'd drawn a heart around the words. She'd used up the whole red crayon on it that morning working at the kitchen table before school, her tongue poking out the side of her mouth the way it always did when she concentrated. "Bring this so you're not scared," she'd told him. "It's magic." Ethan folded the 2 biggest pieces together and slid them into his jacket pocket over his heart, and then he stood back up. Above him from the little stage at the front of the ballroom, Victoria Ashford was still talking. She had a champagne flute in one hand and a microphone in the other, and she was performing for the crowd the way she always did. "Do you know what I love about tonight?" she was saying. "I love that we get all this security, all these lawyers, all these procedures, and still some man off the street can just wander in and start waving papers around like he owns the place." A ripple of laughter moved through the room. "Sweetheart, this is an investor gala. Do you have any idea how much a seat at these tables costs?" "I'm not trying to cause trouble, ma'am," Ethan said. "He's not trying to cause trouble," she repeated, and the laughter got louder because she'd said it in a mocking little voice, and the crowd loved it. They loved her. She was Victoria Ashford. She'd been on the cover of every business magazine in America. She'd taken Ashford Technologies from a struggling firm to a $90 billion giant. Or at least that was the story she told, and she told it beautifully. "I just need someone on the board to look at these documents," Ethan said. "That's all. 5 minutes. The documents." She set down her champagne. "Show me these documents." And that was her first mistake, though nobody knew it yet. Ethan reached into his jacket into the other pocket and pulled out a manila envelope folded once down the middle. His hands weren't shaking. He'd expected worse than this if he was honest. He'd lain awake for weeks imagining how this might go, and in most of those imaginings, they'd thrown him out before he ever got in the door. He held the envelope out. "It's all in here, the estate paperwork, the transfer of..." Victoria came down off the stage. Her heels clicked on the marble sharp and even, and the crowd parted for her. She was tall and beautiful in the cold, expensive way that money makes people beautiful, and she walked right up to Ethan Carter and took the envelope out of his hand. She opened it. She pulled out the pages. She looked at the top one for exactly 2 seconds. Then she laughed and threw the whole thing on the floor. Then papers scattered everywhere. The founder's estate seal, the ownership records, the notarized signatures, all of it fanning out across the marble under the feet of the richest people in the country. "Do you know how many people try this every year?" she said. "Do you have any idea? Long-lost heir, secret inheritance. My uncle worked here in 1985. Everybody's got a story. Everybody thinks they're owed something." She stepped closer to him, close enough that only the front rows could hear, and her voice dropped. "Let me tell you something, worker. Nobody is coming to save you. You're going to be walked out of here by that boy in the cheap uniform, and tomorrow you're going to go back to whatever loading dock you crawled out of, and you're going to tell your friends you almost had it. Because men like you always almost have it." And Ethan Carter looked at her. He didn't say anything for a long moment. "You dropped my daughter's drawing," he said. "It was on top of the papers. Would you please not step on it?" That was when she saw it, the crayon paper half hidden among the legal documents. And instead of stepping around it, she bent down and picked it up, held it up to the light, read it out loud in that same mocking voice. "For Daddy, you are the strongest." She smiled at him. "Oh, that's precious." And she tore it in half. The room went a little quiet then. Even the people who'd been laughing, something in them flinched. Because there's a line, and even in a room full of people who'd forgotten most of their decency, most of them knew that line was somewhere, and tearing up a child's drawing was on the wrong side of it. She tore it again, and she let it fall. "Get him out," she said, and turned her back and walked toward the stage, her heels clicking, the crowd swallowing her up again. That was her second mistake, and it was the one she'd never recover from. The young guard's name was Marcus, and Marcus felt sick. He'd been working security at Ashford Technologies for 8 months. He had a 2-year-old at home and a wife who worked nights at the hospital, and he needed this job the way you need air. He knew exactly what would happen to him if he made a scene. He knew the rules. Escort the man out. Don't engage. Don't make eye contact with the guests. But he'd watched Victoria Ashford tear up a little girl's drawing, and he'd watched this man, this quiet, tired man in a funeral suit, get down on his knees to save the pieces, and something in Marcus's chest had cracked open. "I'm sorry," Marcus said under his breath, walking Ethan toward the doors. "I'm real sorry, man. I just work here." "I know," Ethan said. "It's all right, son. You're doing your job." That was messed up. What she did. That was... Marcus swallowed. "My daughter draws me pictures too." Ethan stopped walking. He turned and looked at the young man, really looked at him, and for the first time all night, something moved behind his eyes. Not anger, not even sadness exactly, but a kind of recognition. One father to another. "How old?" Ethan asked. "She's 2, just turned 2. They stay little for about 10 minutes, Ethan said. Then they're gone. My wife used to say that. Enjoy it, Ethan. They're only little for 10 minutes. He said, used to very carefully the way a man handles something breakable. "Take care of that girl." "Yes, sir." Marcus's throat was tight. "I will." What? They were almost at the doors. Behind them, up on the stage, Victoria Ashford had picked her microphone back up and was welcoming the head of some investment fund to say a few words, and the gala was rolling on like nothing had happened, like a man hadn't just been humiliated in front of the entire industry, like there wasn't crayon paper scattered on the floor. And that's when the doors opened. They opened from the outside, both of them at once, pushed by 2 men in dark suits who were most definitely not on the guest list. Behind them came a woman in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back tight, carrying a leather portfolio case, and she walked into that ballroom like she'd built it. "Stop right there," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. It was the voice of someone who'd spent 40 years in courtrooms and had never once been the second most important person in a room. "Mr. Carter, don't take another step." Ethan turned around. "Margaret," he said. "I told you to wait for me in the car," the silver-haired woman said, striding toward him, her heels clicking too, but differently than Victoria's somehow. "I told you I'd handle the entrance, but no, you had to come in alone and try to be polite about it." She reached him and put a hand on his arm and looked him up and down. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." "They put their hands on you." "It's fine, Margaret." "It is not fine." She turned and looked at Marcus, who was frozen in place. "Young man, remove your hand from my client's shoulder." Marcus removed his hand so fast you'd have thought Ethan was on fire. Up on the stage, the room had gone quiet again, and Victoria Ashford lowered her microphone and squinted out at the disturbance by the doors. "I'm sorry," Victoria called out. "Who let these people in? Security." The woman named Margaret didn't even look at her. She crouched down, 60-something years old, in a $2,000 suit, and she started gathering the scattered legal documents off the marble floor, one by one, gently, the way you'd pick up something sacred. And she gathered the torn pieces of Lily's drawing too, and she held those separately carefully in her left hand. Then she stood up, and now she looked at Victoria Ashford. "My name," she said, "is Margaret Chen. I'm the managing partner at Chen Okafor and Ross. I am the attorney of record for the estate of Robert Ashford, the founder of this company." She let that sit for a second. "And I represent the man you just had thrown out of his own building." The whisper that went through the crowd was like wind through wheat. "Bo." Victoria's smile stayed on her face, but something behind it went still. "The estate of Robert Ashford was settled years ago," she said. "My father-in-law's affairs are none of your—" "Your father-in-law," Margaret repeated. And she smiled, and it was not a warm smile. "That's an interesting thing to call him Ms. Ashford. Considering you were married to his nephew. Considering you took the family name when you married into it and kept it after the divorce because it looked good on magazine covers. Considering you are not and have never been an Ashford by blood, by will, or by any legal instrument I've ever seen." She tilted her head. "Would you like me to go on? Because I can go on for quite a while. I brought documents." The silence in that ballroom was total now. 2,000 of the most powerful people in America, and you could have heard a pin drop on that marble. "This is absurd," Victoria said, but her voice had changed, just slightly, just enough. Robert Ashford had no living heirs. His only daughter died. His only daughter, Margaret said quietly, was named Sarah. And across the room, Ethan Carter closed his eyes. "Sarah Ashford," Margaret went on, "walked away from this family and this fortune when she was 23 years old because she did not want any part of what it was doing to the people in it. She changed her name. She became a schoolteacher. She married a man who fixed things with his hands and never asked her for a dime." Margaret's voice softened, but only for a moment. "She married Ethan Carter, and she loved him, and they had a daughter named Lily, and they were happy, in a small house on a small street for 11 years. Until 18 months ago, when Sarah Carter was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer." Somewhere in the crowd, someone gasped. Before she died, Margaret said, Sarah did the one thing her father had always begged her to do. She accepted her inheritance. Quietly, legally. Every share of controlling stock her father had held in trust for her since the day she was born, 74% of the voting authority in Ashford Technologies. And then she did what any mother would do. Margaret looked at Ethan now, and her hard face gentled. She left it to her husband and her child, so that no one could ever tell them they didn't belong. So that no one could ever look at her family the way this room just looked at that man and get away with it. She turned back to Victoria. "He didn't come here for revenge, Ms. Ashford. God knows he didn't want any of this. He came here to hand you paperwork and ask politely for a meeting with the board. That's the kind of man he is. That's the kind of man his wife married." Margaret's voice went cold as January. "You threw it on the floor. And then you tore up his daughter's drawing, on camera, in front of 2,000 witnesses and a live audience of—" She glanced at one of her associates. "Just over 400,000, the associate murmured. 400,000 people, Margaret finished. Watching right now." Victoria Ashford's eyes flicked just for an instant to the red camera light at the back of the room. The live stream. She had insisted on the live stream. It had been her idea, transparency she'd called it. Let the world see how Ashford does business. The world was seeing. "Get me the board," Victoria said. Her voice had dropped to something low and dangerous. "Get me the chairman, right now. I want this stunt verified and thrown out tonight." That's a wonderful idea, Margaret Chen said. As it happens, I called them an hour ago. She looked toward the doors. They're already here. Ethan wasn't watching Victoria anymore. He was watching the doors, where an older man in a gray suit had appeared, stooped a little, leaning on a cane, with white hair and a lined face, and eyes that were fixed on Ethan across the whole length of the ballroom. The old man's name was Walter Boyd. He'd been on the board of Ashford Technologies for 31 years. He'd been Robert Ashford's best friend. He'd known Sarah since she was a baby. He'd cried at her funeral in the back pew where nobody saw, because a man of his generation didn't cry where people could see. No. And now he was walking across the ballroom toward the daughter's husband, and the closer he got, the harder it was for him to breathe, because Ethan Carter had Sarah's eyes in his memory, and Sarah's little girl at home, and Walter Boyd had spent 18 months believing this family was gone. "Son," Walter said when he finally reached him. His voice broke on the word. "Son, I am so sorry. I didn't know you were coming. I didn't know if I'd known—" He stopped. He looked down at the papers in Margaret's hands and the torn drawing on top, and his old jaw tightened. "Is that Lily's?" "Yes, sir," Ethan said. "She did that to it." "Yes, sir." Walter Boyd turned around slowly, leaning on his cane, and he looked up at Victoria Ashford on her little stage and 31 years of board meetings and forced smiles, and looking the other way, all seemed to come loose in him at once. "Victoria," he said, "you have run this company like it belonged to you. You have insulted its people and buried its founder's memory, and lined your own pockets while good men and women got laid off by the hundreds." His voice was shaking, but not with fear. "I have watched it for 6 years, and I told myself there was nothing I could do. And tonight you tore up a child's drawing on a live broadcast." He shook his head. "You just handed us the rope, girl. You handed it to us and tied the knot yourself." "Walter," Victoria said, "you don't have the authority to—" "No," Walter agreed. "I don't, but he does." And he turned, and with a hand that trembled from age and emotion, both he gestured to Ethan Carter, the warehouse supervisor in the funeral suit, standing quietly by the doors, with his daughter's torn drawing in a lawyer's careful hands. "The board is prepared to verify the documents tonight," Walter said loud enough for the whole room. "Every page, every signature. And if they are what I already know in my heart they are, then this man controls 74% of the voting shares of Ashford Technologies, which means, Victoria, that as of the moment those papers are confirmed—" His voice steadied and rang out clear across the marble. "You don't work here anymore. He decides that." The champagne flute in Victoria Ashford's hand slipped just slightly, and a little wine spilled over the rim onto her fingers, and for the first time all night, she didn't seem to notice. Ethan Carter stepped forward into the middle of that enormous silent room. 400,000 people were watching. The most powerful people in the country were watching, and he wasn't thinking about any of them. He was thinking about a small house on a small street. He was thinking about a kitchen table and a red crayon worn down to a nub. He was thinking about Sarah and the promise he'd made her in a hospital room that still woke him up at 3 in the morning. "Protect our girl, Ethan. Protect our girl. Don't let them make her feel small." "Ma'am," he said to Victoria Ashford, and even now, even after everything, his voice was calm and even and unbearably tired. "I didn't come here to take anything from you. I came here to ask for 5 minutes. You wouldn't give me 5 minutes." He held out his hand toward Margaret, and she placed the torn pieces of Lily's drawing into his palm, and he looked down at them at his daughter's careful red heart torn straight down the middle. "But you tore up my little girl's drawing," Ethan said. He looked back up. "And that's the one thing tonight I don't think I can forgive." Orchestrated, emotionally charged narrative continuation with dialogue-driven pacing and strategic climactic beats. Orchestrated, emotionally charged narrative continuation with dialogue-driven pacing and strategic climactic beats. The room did not breathe. Victoria Ashford stood on her little stage with wine dripping off her fingers, and for the first time in her adult life, She could not find a single word worth saying. She had built an entire career on always having the next word, the sharper word, the word that ended the conversation. Now there was nothing. Just the eyes of 2,000 people and the small red camera light at the back of the room, and a warehouse supervisor holding the pieces of a child's drawing like they were the only thing in the building that mattered. "Verify the documents," she finally said. Her voice came out thin. "Walter, verify them. Right now. In front of everyone. Because when they turn out to be forgeries, and they will, I want every person in this room to watch me have this man arrested." "That's fair," Margaret Chen said pleasantly. "Let's do exactly that." Shiz. And that was Victoria's third mistake, though she was long past counting them now. Because a woman with any instinct for self-preservation would have stalled, would have demanded Time lawyers' private review anything to get those cameras off and those witnesses gone. But Victoria Ashford had never once in her life believed she could lose in front of an audience. The audience was where she won. So she called for the verification in public live, with the whole world watching. Margaret Chen was already opening her leather portfolio. "Mr. Boyd," she said, "as a sitting member of the board, would you do us the honor of examining the documents personally, since Ms. Ashford seems to feel my word can't be trusted?" "I'd be glad to," Walter Boyd said. He limped to the nearest table, and one of Margaret's associates cleared away the abandoned champagne glasses with a single sweep of his arm, and Margaret began laying out the pages one at a time. Walter took a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket, and his old hands shook a little as he settled them on his nose, and he bent over the first document. The whole ballroom watched an 81-year-old man read. "This is the original trust instrument," Walter said quietly, mostly to himself. "Robert set this up, and my God, this is dated the year Sarah was born. He put it in her name the week she came home from the hospital." He touched the page with one finger. "That's his signature. I'd know it anywhere. I watched him sign 1,000 documents just like this. That little hook on the R." His voice thickened. "That's Robert's hand." "Walter," Victoria said, "handwriting can be forged." "Not the notary seal from 1983, it can't," Margaret said. "Not the county recorder's stamp. Not the trust registration number that anyone in this room can look up on the state database right now tonight on their phone." She looked out at the crowd. "Please, I encourage it. Look it up." And the sound that went through that ballroom then was the small, awful rustle of 2,000 people reaching for their phones at once. And Victoria heard it. She heard the phones come out. And something in her chest went cold because she understood in that sound that the room had stopped being hers. The second document. Walter went on, and his voice was steadier now, gathering strength as the truth settled into his bones. "Is the acceptance of inheritance. Signed by Sarah Ashford Carter 11 months ago." He stopped. He had to take his glasses off and press the back of his hand to his eyes for a moment. 11 months ago. She was already sick when she signed this. Look at the signature. Look how it wavers at the end. He put the glasses back on. She was dying when she did this. She was dying, and she made herself do the one thing she'd sworn she never would, because she was thinking about a little girl who wasn't going to have a mother. Across the room, Ethan Carter's jaw was tight as stone. He was staring at a spot on the marble floor, and he was not going to cry in this room. He had promised himself that in the car he was not going to give them that. "And the third document," Walter said, and now his old voice rang out clear and hard, "is the transfer of ownership and voting authority. Executed by Sarah Carter, witnessed by 2 attorneys, notarized and filed with the state 90 days before her death. It transfers full controlling interest, 74% of the voting shares of Ashford Technologies, to her husband Ethan Carter and their daughter Lily Carter in trust." Walter straightened up as much as his old spine would let him. "It is airtight, it is legal, and it is real." He took his glasses off, folded them, and put them back in his pocket. Then he turned to face the room. "This man," Walter Boyd said, pointing at Ethan, "owns this company. For one full second, nobody moved. And then a woman near the front, a mid-level executive named Diane Foster, who had worked at Ashford for 19 years and had watched 3 rounds of layoffs take her friends, while Victoria Ashford bought a 4th vacation home. Diane Foster stood up out of her chair, and she started to clap. Soy. She clapped alone for exactly 2 seconds, and then the man beside her stood up. And then the whole table. And then it moved across the room like a wave breaking table by table, 2,000 people rising to their feet and applauding a warehouse supervisor in a funeral suit. And it was not polite applause. It was loud and it was angry. And it was the sound of a company that had been afraid for 6 years, finally not being afraid anymore. Victoria Ashford stood on her stage and watched her entire world stand up and turn its back on her. "Stop it," she said. Nobody heard her. "Stop it." She grabbed the microphone. "Stop clapping." The microphone shrieked with feedback, and the applause faltered. And in the sudden silence, Victoria Ashford's voice came out ragged and shaking, and nothing like the smooth, cold voice she'd used to humiliate a widower 20 minutes before. "You think a piece of paper makes him one of us," she said. "You think because some dead woman felt guilty, this nobody gets to walk in here and take everything I built. I built this company. Not Robert Ashford, who was a fool. Not his daughter who ran away. Not this man who moves boxes for a living. Me. I made this company what it is, and I will not stand here and let you clap for a warehouse worker like he's—" "That's enough." The voice came from the doors, and it was quiet, but it cut through the whole room because it was Ethan Carter, and he had not raised his voice once all night, and now he did. "That's enough," he said again, walking toward the stage. "You want to say I move boxes for a living? Ma'am, you go right ahead. I've moved boxes for 20 years. There's no shame in it. Half the people in this room got where they are because folks like me showed up at 4 in the morning to load the trucks." He stopped at the foot of the stage and looked up at her. "But you don't get to stand up there and call my wife a dead woman who felt guilty. Not tonight. Not on this earth. You didn't know her. You're not fit to say her name." Victoria stared down at him. "You want to know why she ran away from all this?" Ethan said. "You're the reason. People like you. She grew up watching folks in rooms like this one tear each other apart over money that none of them would ever spend in 3 lifetimes, and it made her sick. And she got out, and she found a small life with a man who loved her, and she was happy, Victoria. She was happier in our little kitchen than anybody in this whole gilded room has ever been in their life. So don't you dare pity her. Don't you dare." Net. And Victoria Ashford, who had never in her life let anyone have the last word, opened her mouth to fire back and found that Walter Boyd was already speaking into a phone. "Yes," Walter was saying. "This is Walter Boyd, board member, corporate ID 417. I'm calling an emergency session of the board of directors effective immediately under the bylaws provision for controlling shareholder action. All members are present or on the line. I'm invoking Section 9. He listened for a moment. "Yes. Tonight. Right now in this ballroom." "You can't invoke Section 9, Victoria snapped. "Section 9 requires the controlling shareholder to formally request—" "Mr. Carter," Margaret Chen said smoothly, turning to Ethan. "As the controlling shareholder of Ashford Technologies, do you formally request that the board convene to consider the immediate removal of the chief executive officer?" Ethan looked at her. Then he looked up at Victoria one more time. And then he looked past all of them toward the back of the room, where the little red camera light was still glowing. And he thought about the 400,000 people watching, and how many of them had bosses like Victoria Ashford, and how many of them had been told they were just a worker, and how many of them had gone home and told themselves it didn't matter. That's just how the world works. That's just how it is for people like us. "Yes," Ethan said. "I do." "Then it's convened," Walter said. "God help me. After 31 years, it's finally convened." What happened next happened fast, and later, people who were in that room would say it was the strangest thing they ever witnessed. A corporate board meeting held standing up in a ballroom in front of 2,000 people live on the internet at 9:40 on a Thursday night. There were 7 board members. 4 were in the room. 3 joined by phone, their voices coming through the ballroom speakers, thin and crackling and world-changing. Walter Boyd went first. The motion is to remove Victoria Ashford as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately for cause, he said. The cause is documented and extensive, and I'll be entering all of it into the record. But I'll tell you the short version right now so the good people in this room and the good people watching at home understand exactly what we've been living with. He turned to face Victoria. 6 years ago, this woman took over a healthy company. Since then, she has overseen 4 rounds of layoffs totaling nearly 3,000 jobs. She has closed 2 American manufacturing plants, and in that same period her personal compensation has increased 400%. His voice dropped. But that's not the cause. Those are just decisions. Bad ones, cruel ones, but legal. Here's the cause. He nodded to Margaret Chen. And Margaret Chen opened a second folder. About 4 months ago, Margaret said, when the estate first contacted the board's outside counsel to begin the transfer process, we were given access to certain internal financial records. As part of standard due diligence, our forensic accountants reviewed 6 years of executive expenditures. She paused. What they found is currently the subject of a sealed referral to the United States Attorney's Office, and the word federal went through the crowd like an electric shock. Sealed, Victoria said quickly. It's sealed. She can't discuss it. She just said it's sealed. Walter, she can't. I can discuss the parts that are already public record, Margaret said. Would you like me to? There's quite a bit that's public. For instance, there's a consulting firm called Meridian Strategic Advisors, which has been paid $18 million by Ashford Technologies over the last 5 years. Meridian has no website, no employees on record, no office anyone can find. It has exactly one client, which is this company, and it is registered to a mailbox in Delaware. She looked up. And the sole beneficial owner of Meridian Strategic Advisors, according to documents we obtained entirely legally, is a woman named Victoria Ellis, which was Ms. Ashford's name before she married into the family. The gasp that went through the room was enormous. Ethan Carter stood very still watching Victoria's face, and he did not feel triumph. He'd wondered in the car whether he might feel triumph in a moment like this. And now that it was here, he found he only felt tired and sad and far away. Because none of this brought Sarah back, and none of it untore his daughter's drawing, and money that had been stolen was just money. And the only thing he'd ever really wanted was a Thursday night at home with his family, which was a thing that no board meeting on earth could give him. That's a lie, Victoria was saying, but her voice had lost all its steel. Victoria Ellis is a common name. That could be anyone. You have no proof. The wire transfers went to an account you personally opened at First National in 2021, Margaret said. We have the signature card. We have your driver's license photocopy from the account opening. We have your thumbprint, Ms. Ashford, on the bank's own form. She closed the folder. I said the referral is sealed. I didn't say the evidence was hard to find. You weren't even careful. You never thought anyone would look because you never thought anyone would ever have the standing to make you accountable. Margaret nodded toward Ethan. And then a warehouse supervisor walked in with a piece of paper. Victoria Ashford looked out at the room, and for one moment, just one, the mask came off entirely, and everyone saw the fear underneath it, raw and animal and desperate. Walter, she said. Walter, please. We can figure this out. I'll pay it back. Every cent. I'll resign. I'll go quietly. We'll keep it internal. We'll protect the stock price. We'll protect the employees. You don't want a scandal. Walter, you don't want the whole company dragged through. Now you care about the employees, Walter said softly. And that was the sentence that ended her. Not the documents, not the wire transfers, not the federal referral. Just an old man saying quietly, now you care about the employees, and letting the whole room hear how hollow it was. The motion is on the floor, Walter said. All in favor of removing Victoria Ashford as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately for cause, say aye. Aye, said Walter Boyd. Aye, said Diane Foster's boss, a board member named Harrison. who had spent 6 years going along to get along and now sounded like a man setting down a weight he'd carried too long. "I," came a voice through the speakers. "I," came another. "I. 6 eyes. And then a silence, and everyone understood the 7th vote belonged to a man on the phone named Preston Vale, who had been Victoria's closest ally on the board, the one she'd handpicked, the one who'd approved every raise and every layoff and every consulting contract. "Preston," Walter said, "how do you vote?" The speakers crackled. There was a long pause. You could hear the man breathing. "Preston?" Victoria said, and there was hope in her voice now, terrible hope. "Preston, tell them. Tell them this is insane. Tell them who I am. I've seen the Meridian documents, Victoria." Preston Vale's voice said quietly through the speakers. "Margaret's office sent them to all of us an hour ago. Before we came." A pause. "You told me Meridian was legitimate. You looked me in the eye and you told me. I signed off on those payments because I trusted you. I put my name on your fraud." His voice cracked. "My name is on it, Victoria." "Preston." "Aye," said Preston Vale. "I vote aye. God forgive me for how long it took." "That's 7, Walter Boyd said. "Unanimous. Victoria Ashford, you are removed as Chief Executive Officer of Ashford Technologies effective this moment. You are stripped of all authority, all access, and all signatory power. Security." He turned, and his old eyes found young Marcus still standing frozen by the doors. "Young man, come here." Marcus came wide-eyed, unsure why he was being summoned. "What's your name, son?" "Marcus, sir. Marcus Webb." "Marcus Webb," Walter said. "You have the unique honor tonight of doing to this woman exactly what she ordered done to that man 20 minutes ago. Please escort Ms. Ashford from the building. She is no longer employed here. She is no longer welcome here. And when the federal agents arrive, which Ms. Chen assures me will be shortly, you'll hand her over to them." Marcus looked at Ethan, Bate, and Ethan Carter, who now owned the whole company and every person's job in it, gave the young security guard the smallest nod. "It's all right, son," Ethan said. "Do your job." Marcus swallowed hard and turned to Victoria Ashford, and in a voice that shook only a little, he said the words he had been ordered to say to a widower not half an hour before. "Ma'am," Marcus said, "you can't be here. You need to come with me." Victoria Ashford did not move. She stood on her little stage above a room of 2,000 people who had once feared her and now would not even look at her, and she stared down at the man in the funeral suit, and something in her broke that could not be put back together. Because for the first time in her entire life, Victoria Ashford understood that she had lost completely and publicly and forever, and there was no clever word that could fix it. "You did this on purpose," she whispered. "You planned all of it. You came in here weak on purpose. You let me do it so the whole world would watch. Didn't you? Didn't you?" Ethan looked up at her for a long moment. "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "I came in here hoping you'd be kind. I really did. I stood outside those doors for 10 minutes working up the nerve praying you'd be the kind of person who'd give a grieving man 5 minutes of her time. That's the honest truth. I didn't want any of this." He glanced down at the torn drawing in his hand. "You did this, every bit of it. You could have just said, 'Let me see your papers, sir. Please have a seat.' That's all. That would have been the whole story. Nobody would ever have known your name outside this building." He shook his head slowly. "You didn't have to tear up my little girl's picture. That was you. That was all you." And Victoria Ashford had no answer, because there wasn't one, and she knew it, and so she did the only thing left to a person who has lost everything and cannot admit it. She gathered up what was left of her dignity, lifted her chin, and walked down off the stage on her own. Past Marcus, past the silent tables toward the doors, her heels clicking on the marble one last time, a sound that used to make people flinch, and now just sounded small. She got halfway to the doors before they opened. 3 people came through, and they weren't in tuxedos or evening gowns. They were in plain dark suits, and the woman in front held up a badge, and her voice was flat and official, and it filled the whole silent ballroom. Victoria Ashford, Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of wire fraud, money laundering, and embezzlement. The agent nodded to the man beside her, who was already reaching for handcuffs. Ma'am, please put your hands behind your back. Victoria's face went white. Walter said the referral was sealed. Margaret, you said it was... The referral was sealed, Margaret Chen said. The indictment was handed down this morning. We were waiting for you to be removed as CEO before executing the warrant so that you couldn't destroy company records on your way out. She allowed herself the smallest smile. You really shouldn't have insisted on doing the verification in public, Ms. Ashford. It gave the agent such a convenient place to find you. The handcuffs closed around Victoria Ashford's wrists with a sound that everybody in that room heard, and everybody watching at home heard, and everybody would remember for the rest of their lives. And as they walked her toward the doors past 2,000 people who had once applauded her every word, past the tables and the champagne, and the little stage where she'd built her whole legend, Victoria Ashford turned her head one last time and found Ethan Carter in the crowd. You'll ruin it, she spat. You don't know anything about running a company. You'll drive it into the ground in a year. You're just a worker. And Ethan Carter looked back at her, and for the first time all night he smiled, not cruelly, not in triumph, just a small, sad, tired smile. The smile of a man who had buried his wife and raised his daughter alone and shown up to a room full of the most powerful people in the country and been called worthless and had endured all of it standing up. Yes, ma'am, he said. I am, and I'm proud of it. They took her out through the doors she'd had him thrown toward, and the doors closed behind her, and she was gone. For a moment, the whole ballroom just stood there. 2,000 people, not quite able to believe what they had witnessed. The champagne going flat in their glasses, the live stream still running. And then Diane Foster, the executive who'd been the first to stand, walked over to Ethan Carter through the crowd. She was crying, and she wasn't trying to hide it. And when she reached him, she didn't say anything grand or important. She just held out her hand. Mr. Carter, she said, I've worked here 19 years. I watched them lay off my whole team 2 Christmases ago. I've been so ashamed to work here for so long that I stopped telling people where I worked. She wiped her eyes. I just wanted to shake your hand. That's all. I'm sorry. I wanted to shake your hand. Beso. And Ethan Carter took her hand. This stranger, this woman he'd never met, and he held it in both of his, and something in his chest that had been clenched tight since the moment he walked through those doors, finally loosened. You've got nothing to be ashamed of, ma'am, he said gently. You stood up first. I saw you. You were the first one on your feet and everybody else followed you. You want to know something that took more courage than anything I did tonight? I had a piece of paper in my pocket that made me safe. You didn't have anything but your own 2 feet. And you stood up anyway when you didn't know how it was going to end. He pressed her hand. Don't you ever be ashamed of working for a living. Don't you dare. There's more honor in this room right now than in every board meeting this company's had in 6 years, and it's not coming from the papers in that lawyer's folder. It's coming from you. Merci. Diane Foster cried harder, and she wasn't the only one. And behind her, one by one, the people of Ashford Technologies began to come forward, executives and assistants, and mid-level managers, people who'd spent years being told they were replaceable, coming to shake the hand of a warehouse supervisor who owned the company now, and still called every one of them sir and ma'am. Walter Boyd stood off to the side, leaning on his cane, watching it happen, and there were tears running down the deep lines of his old face, and he did not wipe them away this time. He was thinking about Robert Ashford, his oldest friend dead these 6 years, who had loved his daughter more than the whole empire he'd built, and who had never once stopped hoping she'd come home. You'd have loved this, Bob, Walter said quietly to no one, to a man who wasn't there. She didn't come home, but she sent us the best part of herself. She sent us him. And across the ballroom, Ethan Carter, the man everyone had laughed at, shook hand after hand after hand, holding in the other hand the torn pieces of a drawing that said, "You are the strongest," and thinking over and over the same simple thought. The only thought that had ever really driven him the promise he'd made in a hospital room to a woman he'd have traded every share of this company to hold one more time. "I've got her, Sarah. I've got our girl. Nobody's ever going to make her feel small. I promise. I've got her." It was almost 11 o'clock when Ethan Carter finally got out of that building, and the last thing he did before he left was find young Marcus Webb standing by the coat check, still in shock, still not quite believing what his night had turned into. "You did good tonight, son," Ethan told him. "I almost threw you out, sir," Marcus said miserably. "I had my hand on your shoulder. I was going to put you on the sidewalk. You had a family to feed and a job to keep. You did what you had to do, and you did it gentle. And you told me you were sorry when nobody in that whole room would even look at me." Ethan put a hand on the young man's arm. "I'm not going to forget that. You hear me? A man who owns a company remembers the ones who were decent to him when he had nothing. Go home. Kiss that baby girl of yours. And Monday morning you come find me, because I've got a feeling a man with a conscience like yours is being wasted standing by a door." Marcus's eyes filled up, and he couldn't say a word, so he just nodded, and Ethan squeezed his arm and walked out into the night. Margaret Chen drove them home herself. She'd sent her associates back to the office and dismissed the car service because she said there were things a person ought to talk about without a driver listening, and she'd known Ethan Carter for 4 months now, and she'd come to think of him as something close to a friend, which was not a thing that happened often to a woman like Margaret Chen. "You'll have to give a statement to the U.S. Attorney's Office next week," she said as she drove. "About the drawing, about tonight. They'll want it for the trial." "I don't want to be part of a trial, Margaret." "You're a witness to her character, Ethan. A woman who would tear up a child's picture in front of a live camera is a woman a jury needs to see clearly." She glanced over at him. "You don't have to hate her to tell the truth about her." "I don't hate her," Ethan said, looking out the window. "I keep waiting to. Everybody keeps telling me I've earned the right. But I just keep thinking what happened to that woman. That she got like that. Somewhere back there, she was a little girl too. Somebody must have made her feel small. Once. Real small. And she decided the only way to never feel it again was to make everybody else feel it first." He shook his head. "That's a sad way to live a whole life. I don't hate her. I just feel sorry for her, and I feel a whole lot sorrier for everybody she stepped on to get where she got." And Margaret drove in silence for a moment. "Sarah married a good man," she finally said. "I only met her twice at the end when she was very sick, but she talked about you like you were something she couldn't quite believe she'd been lucky enough to find." Margaret's voice went soft in a way Ethan had never heard from her all night. "She made me promise I'd take care of you, both of you. She was worried you'd let them push you around. She said Ethan's too kind. Margaret, he'll try to be polite about it. He'll let them walk all over him." Margaret laughed a little wetly. "She was right. You did let them walk all over you, right up until the moment they couldn't anymore." Ethan didn't answer. He was looking down at the torn drawing in his hands, the two halves he'd been holding all night, unwilling to put them in his pocket, where they might get bent. And Margaret saw him looking, and she understood, and she didn't say anything else for the rest of the drive. His house was small and dark except for the porch light, which his sister-in-law Rachel always left on when she was babysitting, and when Margaret pulled up to the curb, Ethan sat there for a second with his hand on the door. "Margaret," he said, "thank you for all of it, for finding me, for believing a warehouse guy could pull this off." "Ethan," Margaret said, "you didn't need me to believe it. You needed you to believe it, and you did. Now go inside and see your daughter. She's the whole reason any of tonight mattered. Everything else is just money." He went in quiet the way he always did when Lily was asleep, easing the door shut behind him, and Rachel was on the couch with the TV on low, and when she saw his face, she muted it and stood up. "It's everywhere," Rachel said. "Ethan, it's everywhere. The live stream somebody clipped it, your name is trending. My phone hasn't stopped." She stared at him. "Is it real?" Did it really happen the way it looks? It's real, Ethan said tiredly. She tore up Lily's drawing. Rachel's voice cracked. She'd been there that morning. She'd watched Lily make it. That witch tore up Lily's. Ethan, is Lily okay? Does she know I didn't tell her anything? I didn't let her watch? She thinks you just went to a work party. She doesn't need to know any of it, Ethan said firmly. Not the bad part. Not ever if I can help it. As far as Lily's concerned, Daddy went to a meeting and came home. That's the whole story. He looked toward the hallway toward his daughter's room. She go down okay? She fought it. She wanted to wait up for you. Rachel smiled sadly. She made me promise to tell you she kept the magic working the whole time. Her words, tell Daddy I kept the magic working so he'd be safe. And that was the thing that finally broke Ethan Carter. Not Victoria Ashford's cruelty. Not the 2,000 people laughing. Not the security guard's hand on his shoulder, or the papers scattered on the marble, or even the sight of his little girl's drawing torn in half on the floor. He'd stood through all of that with his back straight. But tell Daddy I kept the magic working so he'd be safe. That one got all the way in, and his face crumpled, and he had to put his hand over his mouth, and Rachel crossed the room and put her arms around her dead sister's husband and held on while he shook. She kept it working, Ethan managed. Rachel, the whole time she thought she was keeping me safe. She was, Rachel whispered. You went in there, and you came out standing. Sounds to me like the magic worked just fine. He stood in his kitchen at midnight, and he cried for the first time since the funeral quiet. So he wouldn't wake his daughter, and Rachel held him, and neither of them said Sarah's name, because they didn't have to. Whoa! Then he wiped his face, and he thanked Rachel, and he walked her to her car, and he came back inside, and he did the thing he'd come home to do. He got the tape from the kitchen drawer, and he sat down at the same table where his daughter had worn a red crayon down to a nub that morning, and he took the two torn halves of her drawing, and slowly, carefully, with hands that had loaded 1,000,000 boxes, and held his wife's hand while she died, he taped them back together. It wasn't perfect. There was a white seam right down the middle, right through the heart she'd drawn, but you could still read every word. For Daddy, you are the strongest. Love, Lily. He got up and he hung it on the refrigerator with the same magnet that had held it that morning, and he stood back and looked at it, the tape and all, and he decided he would never take it down as long as he lived. The tear was part of it now. The tear was the whole story. Then he checked on his daughter. Watched her breathe for a minute in the dark, the way he did every single night, and he went to bed, and for the first time in 18 months, Ethan Carter slept without dreaming. The next morning, the world was on fire, and none of it could touch the inside of that small house. Lily woke him up at 6:40 by climbing into his bed and putting her cold feet on him the way she did every morning. And she asked him how the work party was, and he said it was long and boring. And she asked if the magic worked, and he said, "It worked perfect, sweetheart. It kept me safe the whole time." And she nodded very seriously, like she'd known it would. She was 7 years old. She had her mother's eyes exactly. She had no idea that overnight her father had become one of the most talked about men in America, and Ethan intended to keep it that way for as long as a child could reasonably be kept from the internet, which he understood was not forever, but he'd take what he could get. He made her pancakes. He drove her to school. He walked her to the door like he always did, and he watched her run in to find her friends. And only when she was safely inside did he look at his phone, which had 416 missed messages on it. He'd barely gotten back to the car when it rang in his hand. Margaret. "Turn on any news channel," Margaret said. "Any of them. It doesn't matter which." "I don't want to, Margaret." "I know you don't. Turn it on anyway because I need you to understand what you're walking into today. And I need you to understand it before the board calls, which they will within the hour." A pause. "Ethan, the stock opened this morning, and it's up 11%. 11 in one night. Do you understand what that means?" "That people are glad she's gone." "That people are glad she's gone," Margaret confirmed. "The whole world watched a good man get treated like garbage, and then watched the truth come out. And this morning, every ordinary person in America who's ever been talked down to by their boss went and looked up Ashford Technologies, and a lot of them liked what they saw. You're not just the owner now, Ethan. You're a symbol. And symbols get asked to do things. The board wants you to become chairman. Today, Ethan sat in his parked car outside his daughter's elementary school and closed his eyes. I don't know how to be a chairman, Margaret. Nobody does it first. But here's the thing, and I need you to hear it, because you're about to try to talk yourself out of it. Margaret's voice was firm. There are two kinds of people who could sit in that chair right now. There are people who know everything about running a company and nothing about the people who work in it. That company had one of those for 6 years, and it nearly destroyed the place. Or there's a man who knows nothing about running a company and everything about the people who work in it. And I promise you, Ethan Carter, the second kind is rarer and harder to find and worth 10 of the first. You can hire people who know the business. You cannot hire a conscience. You already have one. That's the whole job. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. There'll be people counting on me, he said. Thousands of them. If I do it wrong, families get hurt. Real families like mine. Yes, Margaret said. That's exactly right. And do you know why I'm not worried? Because that sentence you just said, families get hurt. Real families like mine. Victoria Ashford never once said that sentence in 6 years. It never crossed her mind. It's the first thing that crossed yours. A pause. Come to the office at 10. Wear the good suit. This is my only suit, Margaret. Then we're buying you a suit first. Come at 9:30. None. He laughed, and it surprised him, and it felt good, and he said, All right, all right. 9:30, and he hung up and sat there another minute in the quiet, and then he drove downtown to become the chairman of a $90 billion company in a borrowed hour, before he had to pick his daughter up from school at 3. The Ashford Technologies headquarters was 40 stories of glass in the middle of the city, and Ethan had been inside it exactly once before the day Margaret first showed him the documents, and he'd felt like a trespasser then, and he felt like one now, walking through the lobby in a new gray suit that Margaret had all but forced onto him at a department store, past a security desk where the guards straightened up when they saw him, because every guard in the building had watched the live stream. Walter Boyd was waiting for him by the elevators, leaning on his cane. There he is, Walter said, and his old face lit up. There's the man of the hour. Mr. Boyd. Walter, for God's sake, son, you own the building I'm standing in. You can call me Walter. He pressed the button for the top floor. How's the little girl this morning? She's good. She doesn't know about any of it. I'd like to keep it that way. Good, Walter said with feeling. Good. Keep her out of it. This world will get its hooks into her soon enough. Let her be 7 a while longer. The elevator rose. Ethan, before we walk into that boardroom, there's something I have to tell you, and I want to tell you when it's just us, because I couldn't say it last night with all those people watching. The elevator climbed. Walter's old hands were tight on his cane. I knew, Walter said quietly. About Sarah. That she was Robert's daughter, that she'd run off all of it. I've known for 30 years. And when she got sick and Robert's estate lawyers came to me last spring and told me the daughter had accepted the inheritance before she passed and left it to her husband, I knew about you 6 months ago, Ethan. 6 months. His voice broke. And I did nothing. I let Victoria run this place into the ground for 6 more months while the paperwork went through channels, because I told myself it wasn't my place. It wasn't the right time. We had to do it properly. And all that time you were out there loading trucks, raising that baby alone, grieving your wife, and you didn't even know yet what was coming. Walter had to stop. His whole body was shaking. I could have come to you months ago. I could have made it easier. I'm an old man and I was a coward, and I let you walk into that gala last night without any warning, and I will regret that till the day I die. So before you take this job, before you shake one hand in that room, I need you to know that, and I'll understand if you'd rather I wasn't part of it. The elevator stopped. The doors opened onto the 40th floor. Neither man moved. Ethan looked at Walter Boyd at the shame and grief written all over that lined old face. And he did the thing that nobody in that building expected, and that would define every single day of his time as chairman. He forgave him. "Walter," Ethan said gently, "you were Sarah's father's best friend. You cried at her funeral in the back where you thought nobody saw. My sister-in-law saw you. She told me about the old man in the back pew who cried harder than anybody, and I always wondered who that was. And now I know." Ethan put his hand on Walter's shoulder. "You loved her. That's not nothing. That's not the act of a coward. You were scared and you moved too slow and it cost some time. And I understand that better than most because Lord knows I've been scared and moved too slow more times than I can count." He gripped the old man's shoulder. "I don't need you to be perfect, Walter. I need you to help me not run this place into the ground. Can you do that?" Walter Boyd, 81 years old, wept openly in an elevator and nodded and could not speak. "Then that's settled," Ethan said. "Let's go to work." They walked into the boardroom together, and the 6 remaining board members stood up when Ethan Carter entered, and it was quiet, and every one of them was studying him, trying to figure out what kind of man had just inherited the power to end their careers with a word. Ethan looked around the long table, and then he did the most unexpected thing of all. He didn't sit at the head. He pulled out a chair in the middle, an ordinary chair, and he sat down in it, and he set his hands on the table, and he looked around at all of them. "I know what you're all thinking," Ethan said. "You're thinking here's a warehouse guy who's never run anything bigger than a loading crew, and now he owns the whole company, and he's probably going to come in here angry and clean house and fire everybody who ever worked with Victoria." He let that sit. "That's not what's going to happen. I want to tell you what is." 6 of the most powerful executives in American technology sat perfectly still and listened to a man in a department store suit. "I don't know how to run this company," Ethan said plainly. "I'll say it out loud so nobody has to whisper it. I don't know your business. I couldn't read a balance sheet 6 months ago. I've spent every night since studying, and I've learned a lot. But I'm not going to stand up here and pretend I'm the smartest person in this room because I'm not, and we'd all know I was lying." He leaned forward. "But I know one thing that the last person in this chair forgot. I know what it feels like to be the person at the bottom of this company. I know what it feels like to load the trucks and clock out and drive home wondering if the next round of layoffs has your name on it. I know what it feels like to be called just a worker." He paused. "There are almost 30,000 people who work for Ashford Technologies. Every single one of them has a kitchen table like mine. Every one of them has somebody at home counting on that paycheck. And for 6 years, the person in this chair treated them like line items. Like numbers you cross out to make the other numbers look prettier." He looked around the table, meeting every pair of eyes. "That's over," Ethan said. "Starting today, we don't cross out a single person without me looking them in the eye first, at least on paper, at least by name. If we have to make a hard choice, we're going to make it like it's costing somebody their kitchen table because it is. That's the only rule I've got. Everything else, I'm going to lean on all of you to teach me. But that one rule, I'm not moving on. Not for 11%, not for 100%, not for anything." He sat back. "If any of you can't work under that rule, I understand, and there's the door, no hard feelings. But if you can, if any of you got into this business because you wanted to build something instead of just squeezing it, then I could sure use the help because I've got a company to learn how to run and a 7-year-old to pick up from school at 3. For a long moment, nobody said anything. And then Diane Foster's boss, the board member named Harrison, the one who'd gone along to get along for 6 years, put both his hands flat on the table and pushed himself to his feet and looked at Ethan Carter with something in his eyes that hadn't been there in a very long time. "Mr. Carter," Harrison said, "I've worked at this company for 22 years, and I think that's the first time in 6 of them that anybody in this room has said the word kitchen table." He nodded slowly. "I'm in. Whatever you need. I'm in." And one by one around that long table, every board member rose to their feet, and this time it wasn't fear that made them stand. The first 90 days were the hardest of Ethan Carter's life. Harder in their own way than the 18 months after Sarah died, because grief you could carry alone in the dark, and this you had to carry in front of 30,000 people who were counting on you to know what you were doing. He learned to read the reports. He stayed up past midnight most nights after Lily was asleep with a stack of documents and Margaret Chen's phone number and Walter Boyd's endless patience, and he taught himself the language of the company one word at a time. He made mistakes. He approved a thing he should have questioned, and questioned a thing he should have approved. And every time Walter would gently steer him back. And every time Ethan would say, "Thank you. Tell me why." And he'd write it down, and he wouldn't make the same mistake twice. But the thing nobody expected, the thing that started changing the company from the inside, wasn't the reports. It was the mornings. Because Ethan Carter, chairman of Ashford Technologies, kept doing a thing that made his security detail crazy, and his board nervous, and his employees fall a little bit in love with him. He kept showing up at the loading docks at 5 in the morning. Not every morning, but 2 or 3 times a week before the sun came up, before the executives arrived, he'd park his own car in the regular lot and walk into the warehouse district of the company he owned, and he'd find the men and women loading the trucks, and he'd talk to them. Not a photo op, no cameras, just a man who'd spent 20 years doing exactly what they were doing, leaning against a loading bay with a paper cup of bad coffee, asking them how the job was really going. That's how he found out about the overtime. They cut it 2 years back. A forklift operator named Danny told him 3 weeks into the job. Danny didn't know he was talking to the chairman at first. He thought Ethan was some new supervisor. Used to be we could pick up extra hours around the holidays. Made all the difference. Then the efficiency people came through and killed it. Said the numbers didn't support it. Now half of us are picking up second jobs to cover Christmas. Danny shrugged. That's just how it is, though. You don't work here to get rich. Who told you that? Ethan asked. That you don't work here to get rich. Danny laughed. Everybody. It's just true, man. It shouldn't be, Ethan said quietly, and he wrote overtime holidays. Danny Bay 7 on the little notepad he carried everywhere, and by the following Friday, the holiday overtime was back for every hourly worker in the company, and it cost less than one of Victoria Ashford's old consulting contracts. And Danny found out who Ethan really was when the memo came through with his own words in it. That was the first thing that made the news the good way. A reporter got hold of the story, and chairman reinstates overtime. After 5 a.m. loading dock. Conversation went around the internet the same way the gala footage had, and for the second time in a month, ordinary Americans looked up Ashford Technologies and liked what they saw. The stock went up again. But Ethan didn't care about the stock, and that more than anything was what made the difference. Every executive who'd ever sat across a table from Victoria Ashford had watched her make every single decision based on what it would do to the share price by Friday. Ethan made his decisions based on Danny in Bay 7. And a strange thing happened that none of the finance people could quite explain in their models. The company got better. People who'd been quietly coasting for years, protecting themselves, keeping their heads down, started actually trying again, because for the first time in a long time, it felt like the effort might mean something. 2 months in, they held the first company town hall Ethan had ever led. Broadcast to every Ashford facility in the country, 30,000 people watching from warehouses and offices and plants. He was terrified. He told Walter so in the elevator on the way down. Walter. I've never spoken to more than a loading crew in my life. What do I even say to 30,000 people? Say what you'd say to Danny in Bay 7. Walter told him. 30,000 people is just Danny 30,000 times. Talk to one of them. They'll all hear it. So Ethan stood up in front of a camera in an ordinary conference room. No stage, no lights. Just a man in his one good suit, and he didn't read from a script. My name's Ethan Carter, he said. A lot of you know how I got this job by now. It's a strange story, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't. 6 months ago, I was a warehouse supervisor, same as a lot of you watching right now, And I want you to hold on to that because I want you to know that when I say I understand what your day is like, I'm not saying it to sound nice. I mean it. I did it for 20 years. My back still hurts from it. Some of you loaded a truck this morning and your back hurts too. And I want you to know the man running this company knows exactly what that feels like. And he paused and 30,000 people leaned in. I lost my wife a year and a half ago, Ethan said, and his voice caught just slightly, and he let it because he'd stopped being ashamed of that catch. A lot of you have lost people too. Some of you are going through something hard right now that nobody at work knows about, and you came in anyway, and you did the job anyway because there's somebody at home counting on you. I see you. I want you to know the person in charge sees you. He took a breath. I can't fix everything. I'm going to make mistakes, and when I do, I'm going to tell you about them because I'd rather you trust a man who admits he's wrong than fear one who pretends he never is. But here's my promise. As long as I'm sitting in this chair, this company is going to remember that every number on every report is a person with a kitchen table. That's it. That's the whole speech. Now go home safe tonight and hug whoever's waiting for you, because that's the only part of any of this that actually matters. He didn't know it yet, but a woman in a distribution center in Ohio was crying at her workstation, and a man in a plant in Texas had to walk outside for a minute, and all across the country, 30,000 people were realizing that something had genuinely changed, and it wasn't going back. The clip went viral within the hour. But Ethan didn't see it because at 3 o'clock, he left the most powerful office in the company to go pick his daughter up from school the way he did every single day, because that was the other promise, and it was the one he'd never break for any town hall on earth. Then, on a Tuesday, in the 3rd month, the past came back. Ethan was in his office when Margaret Chen called, and he could tell from her voice in the first 2 words that something was wrong. Victoria's lawyers reached out, Margaret said. She wants to meet with you. Ethan set down his pen. Why? Officially to discuss a settlement of the civil claims before the criminal trial. The company's suing her to recover the $18 million she stole through Meridian, and she wants to negotiate. Margaret paused. Unofficially, Ethan, I think she wants to look you in the eye. I've been doing this 40 years, and I know the difference between a legal meeting and a personal one, and this is personal. You do not have to do it. I'd honestly advise against it. There's nothing she can say that helps you, and plenty she could say that hurts. Ethan looked out the window of his office at the city spread out 40 stories below, at a world that had spent 3 months telling him he was a hero. I'll do it, he said. Ethan, I'll do it, Margaret. Set it up, with lawyers all proper, whatever we need. But I'll do it. He was quiet a moment. She tore up my daughter's drawing, Margaret. I've forgiven a lot of people for a lot of things in my life. I forgave Walter in an elevator. But that one I've been carrying around for 3 months, and I don't want to carry it into the rest of my life. I need to say something to her, just once, and then I need to put it down. They met in a conference room at Margaret's law firm, neutral ground lawyers on both sides, a stenographer in the corner. And when Victoria Ashford walked in, Ethan almost didn't recognize her. The 3 months since the gala had not been kind to her. She was thinner. The expensive armor was gone. She wore a plain suit and no jewelry, and there were lines in her face that makeup couldn't hide anymore. And when she sat down across the table from him, the woman who had once mocked him in front of 2,000 people would not at first meet his eyes. Mr. Carter, her lawyer began. My client is prepared to discuss a structured repayment of the disputed funds in exchange for the company dropping its civil. Can I have the room? Victoria said suddenly. Everyone looked at her. Just him and me, Victoria said. 5 minutes. Lawyers can stand right outside the door. Leave the stenographer if you have to. She finally looked up at Ethan. Please, 5 minutes. And Ethan Carter, who had once begged this exact woman for 5 minutes and been thrown onto a marble floor, looked back at her for a long moment. Give us the room, he said. Margaret leaned close to his ear. Ethan, I strongly advise. 5 minutes, Margaret, it's all right. Give us the room. The lawyers filed out. The stenographer looked at Ethan, and he nodded, and she stepped out too. And then it was just the two of them at a long, empty table. The warehouse worker and the woman who'd called him nothing. And for a moment, neither of them spoke. "They took everything," Victoria said finally. Her voice was flat, hollowed out. "You probably know that. The houses, the accounts they could reach. My name's a punchline now. I can't get a job. I applied for a consulting position last month, a real one small firm, and the man laughed at me. He actually laughed. Said, 'Aren't you the woman from the video?'" She looked at her hands. "I'm going to prison, Mr. Carter. My lawyers are telling me 4 to 7 years. For a woman my age, in the world I lived in, that's the whole rest of a life that means anything." She looked up. "So, I wanted to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me because you're the only honest person I've met in 20 years, and I think you might be the only one who'll tell me the truth." Ethan waited. "Was it worth it?" Victoria asked. "For you. Not the money, not the company. I mean..." Her voice cracked, and it was the first genuine thing he'd ever heard from her. "You walked in there that night, and I destroyed you in front of the world, and then you destroyed me back, and now you have everything, and I have nothing. And you look at me like you don't even hate me, like I'm just some sad thing that happened to you. And I've been trying to understand it for 3 months. How you're not up at night celebrating. How you're not the way I would be if I'd won." She shook her head. "So, was it worth it? Do you feel like you won?" And Ethan Carter looked at this broken woman, and he understood that she genuinely didn't know the answer, that in her entire life nobody had ever taught her the thing he was about to say, and that this might be the only chance anyone ever got to say it to her. "No," Ethan said gently. "I don't feel like I won. Because I wasn't playing the game you were playing, Victoria. You thought we were in a fight that night at the gala. You thought it was you against me, and one of us would win and one of us would lose. But I never wanted to beat you. I just wanted 5 minutes to hand somebody a piece of paper." He leaned forward. "You've spent your whole life thinking that life is about winning and losing, about who's on top and who's on the bottom, and that's why you're sitting where you're sitting. Not because I beat you, because you were playing a game that nobody wins. The people who love their families and do their jobs and treat the person at the bottom like they matter, they're not winning against anybody. They're just living. There's no scoreboard. There never was. You spent your whole life trying to win a game that doesn't exist, and you missed the only part that was ever real." Victoria Ashford stared at him, and her eyes filled up, and she looked away fast, ashamed to let him see it. "When I was 7, she said quietly, "my father lost his job, and we lost the house. And I remember standing in a parking lot while men took our furniture, and the other kids from school drove by and saw, and one of them laughed." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I promised myself that day that nobody would ever look at me like that again, that I would get so high up that nobody could ever laugh at me. And I did it. I clawed all the way to the top of the whole world." She let out a broken sound that was almost a laugh. "And then a warehouse worker walked into my ballroom and I laughed at him the way that kid laughed at me, and it cost me everything. I turned into the exact thing that hurt me. I spent 30 years running from that parking lot, and I built my whole life into it instead." Musse. And there it was, the thing Ethan had wondered about in the car 3 months ago, laid bare on a conference table. Somebody must have made her feel small once, real small. He'd been right. He hadn't wanted to be, but he'd been right. "Victoria," Ethan said, and something in his voice made her look up. "The drawing, my daughter's drawing, that you tore up." He reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet, and from inside it he took a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it and slid it across the table. It was a photograph of Lily's drawing taped back together, the white seam running right down through the red heart. "For Daddy. You are the strongest. Love, Lily." "I taped it back together that night," Ethan said. "It hangs on my refrigerator. My daughter never found out you tore it. As far as she knows, that drawing kept me safe the whole time, and she's right in a way." "It did." He looked at Victoria. "I've been carrying around what you did to it for 3 months. I came here today thinking I'd tell you how much it hurt me that a grown woman would tear up a 7-year-old's picture. I had a whole speech." He shook his head. "But looking at you now, I don't think I need to. Because I think that little girl in you, the one standing in the parking lot watching them take your furniture. I think she's the one who tore it up. She saw a father with a drawing from a daughter who loves him, and it was everything she never got, and it made her so angry she couldn't stand it. That's not an excuse. There's no excuse. But I think that's the truth of it, and I think you already know it." Victoria Ashford put her face in her hands and wept at a conference table in front of the man she'd tried to destroy, and Ethan Carter didn't gloat and didn't comfort her either. He just let her cry because sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a person is let them feel the full weight of a thing they've spent 30 years running from. "I'm going to tell my lawyers to drop the civil suit," Ethan said when she'd gone quiet. "The $18 million the criminal court's going to handle restitution anyway, and dragging you through a second trial doesn't put a single dollar back in anybody's pocket that the first one won't. It just costs the company money to hurt a woman who's already lost everything, and I didn't take this job to hurt people." Victoria looked up stunned. Why would you do that? After everything Because you were right about one thing at the gala," Ethan said, standing up, buttoning his one good suit jacket. "You said I don't know anything about running a company, and you were right back then. I didn't. But I've been learning, and the first thing I learned is that a company is just people all the way down, and how you treat the ones who can't fight back is the whole measure of what kind of place it's going to be." He picked up the photograph, folded it, and put it back in his wallet over his heart. "You couldn't fight back anymore. So there's nothing to win by hitting you. There never was." He walked to the door, and then he stopped with his hand on the handle, and he turned back one last time. "For what it's worth. Victoria, I hope you use the years you've got coming to make peace with that little girl in the parking lot, because she deserved better than what happened to her, and she deserved better than what you did with her, too." He opened the door. "Goodbye, Victoria. I mean it kindly. I hope someday you find something real." And he walked out past the startled lawyers, past Margaret Chen, who searched his face and found something there she hadn't expected, and he rode the elevator down 40 floors in silence, and he stepped out into the afternoon, and he checked his watch. It was 2:40. He had exactly 20 minutes to get across town, and if he hurried, he'd be right on time standing at the school gate with the other parents when the doors opened and his daughter came running out to find him. He made it with 3 minutes to spare. Lily came running out of that school like she did every day, backpack bouncing one shoelace already untied, and she threw herself into her father's arms with the total certainty of a child who has never once doubted that the person she runs toward will catch her. "Daddy," she said, "you came." "I always come, sweetheart," Ethan said, lifting her up, and it was true he always had through the worst 18 months of his life. He had never once missed this gate, not for grief, not for a company, not for anything. "How was school?" And she told him the whole way to the car about a boy who ate a crayon and a girl who could do a cartwheel and a spelling word she got right that nobody else did, and Ethan listened to every word of it like it was the most important briefing he'd get all week, because it was. That night, after she was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table and looked at the drawing on the refrigerator, the one with the tape and the white seam through the heart, and he thought about Victoria Ashford crying at a conference table, and he found that the thing he'd been carrying for 3 months was finally actually gone. He'd set it down. He'd said what he needed to say, and he'd walked out clean, and now the drawing on the fridge wasn't a wound anymore. It was just his daughter's drawing again. It had gone back to being what it always should have been. Why? He didn't know that the hardest year of his life hadn't even started yet. Because 6 weeks later, on a gray Thursday morning, Walter Boyd didn't come to work. Ethan knew something was wrong the moment he walked in because Walter's assistant was standing outside Ethan's office with red eyes and both hands pressed to her mouth, and she didn't have to say a single word. "When?" Ethan asked quietly. "Last night." in his sleep. She could barely get it out. His daughter said he'd been talking about you all week, about how proud he was. He went to bed happy, Mr. Carter. He went to bed happy. Ethan Carter, chairman of a $90 billion company, sat down in a chair in his own hallway and put his head in his hands, because in 8 months, this old man had become something he hadn't had since his own father died 30 years ago, and he hadn't even known how much he'd come to lean on him until the leaning post was gone. Whoa. He gave the eulogy. Of course he did. And he stood up in a church full of people who'd known Walter Boyd for 50 years, longtime board members and old friends, and a daughter and 3 grandchildren. And he told them about an old man who cried in the back pew at a stranger's funeral because he'd loved that stranger's mother since she was a baby. He told them about the elevator, about a man confessing to being a coward, when the truth was, he'd been the bravest man in the whole building, the only one who'd loved Sarah Ashford enough to feel ashamed he hadn't done more. He told them that Walter Boyd had taught a warehouse worker how to run a company one patient night at a time, and had never once made him feel stupid for what he didn't know. He told me the first day, Ethan said, standing at the pulpit, his voice steady because he'd promised himself it would be that 30,000 people is just one person, 30,000 times, that if I could talk to one of them like they mattered, they'd all hear it. That was Walter. He never once in his life met a crowd. He only ever met people one at a time, and he treated every single one of them like they were the only one in the room. Ethan looked out at the faces. I owe him everything I know about the job. But that's not why I'll miss him. I'll miss him because he was kind to a stranger who had nothing when being kind cost him something. And there is no rarer thing on this earth than that. After the funeral, Walter's daughter found Ethan in the parking lot, and she pressed an envelope into his hands. He wanted you to have this, she said. He wrote it a few weeks ago. Said if anything ever happened to him, make sure Ethan gets it. Don't let the lawyers file it. Put it right in his hand. She smiled through her tears. He talked about you like you were one of his own, you know. He never had a son. I think at the end he decided he did. Ethan opened the envelope in his car alone, and inside was a single handwritten page in the shaky hand of an 81-year-old man. Ethan, it read, if you're reading this, then I've gone on ahead and I want you to know I went happy, so don't you carry it around. You gave an old man the best year of his life. For 6 years I watched this company become something I was ashamed of, and I thought I'd die with that shame. And then you walked into that ballroom in your funeral suit, and you gave it all back to me. You gave the whole thing back. Robert would have loved you. He'd have loved you more than he loved his own money, and that's saying something because he loved his money quite a lot. Take care of the little girl. Take care of the 30,000 kitchen tables. And when it gets hard, and it will remember it's just one person 30,000 times, you already know how to talk to one person like they matter. That was always the whole job. You had it before you ever read a single report. Your friend Walter, Ethan Carter, sat in his car in a funeral home parking lot and cried for the second time since Sarah died. And then he folded the letter and put it in his wallet next to the photograph of his daughter's drawing, and he drove to the school because it was almost 3, and there was a little girl who'd be looking for him at the gate. The company got harder after Walter was gone. There was a fight that fall, a real one, the kind Walter would have known how to handle in his sleep, and that Ethan had to figure out with nothing but his own 2 feet under him. A group of major investors, the kind who measured everything in quarters, decided that Ethan Carter was too soft. The stock had climbed all year, but they wanted more faster, and they'd looked at the reinstated overtime and the town halls and the chairman who left at 3 every day to pick up his kid, and they'd decided that the sentimental warehouse worker had had a nice run. But it was time for the grown-ups to take back the wheel. They called for a vote to bring in a new CEO, a hard man from a rival firm, a man famous for cutting companies down to the bone and selling off the pieces. And they had the money to make it happen, or they thought they did because they didn't understand what Ethan understood, which was the one thing his whole strange journey had taught him. The meeting was in the same boardroom where he'd once refused to sit at the head of the table. The investors laid out their case cold and clean and full of numbers, and their man sat there in a suit that cost more than Ethan made in a month at the warehouse, already looking around the room like he owned it. "Mr. Carter," the lead investor said, "let's be adults about this. You've done a lovely job with morale. Truly, the employees adore you. But this is a $90 billion corporation, not a charity, and the market is telling us it's time for professional management. We control enough shares between us to force this vote, and frankly, we'd rather do it with your blessing than without it. So, what'll it be?" And Ethan Carter, warehouse supervisor, looked around the table, and he did the thing that nobody expected, the thing that Walter Boyd would have stood up and cheered for. "You control a lot of shares," Ethan said. "You do. I've done the math same as you. Between all of you, you've got maybe 26%. He leaned back. "I've got 74. The room went quiet. Room went. "See, that's the thing you all forgot," Ethan said, and his voice was as calm and even as it had been the night Victoria Ashford threw his papers on the floor. "You came in here talking about a vote like it was up for grabs. But there's no vote. There was never any vote. My wife didn't leave me a piece of a company. She left me the controlling interest on purpose because she knew a day like this would come. She knew someday men in expensive suits would sit at this table and try to turn this place back into a machine that chews people up. And she made sure that when that day came, one person could stop it cold." He looked around at them. "I'm that person, and I'm stopping it cold." The investor's face went red. "Mr. Carter, you can't just the market. You want to sell your shares, sell them," Ethan said. "The stock's up 30% since I took over. You'll do fine. Take your money and go find a company that'll let you strip it for parts. But it won't be this one. Not while I'm breathing, because I made a promise to a dying woman and a 7-year-old and 30,000 people with kitchen tables, and I don't break promises. Ask anybody who's ever met me. I show up. Every single time." He stood. "This meeting's over. The answer's no. It was always going to be no. You just didn't do your homework." Day. And that was the day the last of the old world finally understood that Ethan Carter wasn't a symbol they could use or a soft touch they could roll. He was the owner. He'd always been the owner. And he would burn his own money before he'd let anybody turn his wife's company into the thing she'd spent her whole life running away from. The investors sold, and the stock dipped for a week, and then it recovered, and then it climbed higher than it ever had, because it turned out that 30,000 people who believed in their company worked harder than 30,000 people who were afraid of it. And the market eventually, in its slow, dumb way, figured that out too. The criminal trial came that winter. Ethan gave his statement quiet and factual, and he described the night at the gala without embellishment. And when the prosecutor asked him to identify the drawing that had been torn, he took the photograph out of his wallet and held it up, taped seam and all, and there wasn't a dry eye in the jury box. Victoria Ashford pleaded guilty in the end, before it went the full distance, and she was sentenced to 5 years, and Ethan didn't go to the sentencing, because he'd already said everything he had to say to her in a conference room, and there was nothing to be gained from watching a broken woman get broken further. But he did one thing that nobody found out about for a long time. Sade. He wrote to her, once a few months after she went in. He didn't tell Margaret, and he didn't tell the board, and he certainly didn't tell the press. He just sat down at his kitchen table one night under his daughter's drawing, and he wrote Victoria Ashford a short letter. He told her he hoped she was holding up. He told her the company was doing well, that the people were happy that the thing she'd built hadn't been destroyed, only healed. And he told her that he'd meant what he said about the little girl in the parking lot, and that it was never too late for a person to make peace with the child they used to be. She wrote back eventually. Just one line. "Thank you for treating me like a person when I gave you every reason not to. Nobody ever taught me how to do that. You did too late, but you did." And Ethan read it, and he folded it up, and he never showed it to a soul, because some kindnesses are meant to stay between the two people who share them. The years went by the way years do, faster than anybody wants them to. And the company thrived. Ethan Carter turned out to be, against every prediction, one of the most respected chairmen in the country. Not because he was the smartest man in any room, but because he was the one who remembered where he came from, And it turned out that was worth more than all the business degrees in the world. Other companies started copying him. The kitchen table rule, people called it, and it spread slowly, the way good things spread, and Ethan never took credit for it, because as far as he was concerned, it wasn't his idea at all. It was Sarah's. It had always been Sarah's. He was just the one who got to carry it into rooms she'd refused to enter. And Lily grew up. That was the part that mattered. The only part that ever mattered. She grew up in the same small house on the same small street. Because Ethan refused to move, refused to let the money change the one thing that had kept them whole. She grew up knowing her father was somebody important at a big company, but she grew up far more certain that her father was the man who never once missed the school gate, who made pancakes on Saturdays, who came to every recital and every game and sat in the front row and clapped like a fool. The company was a thing that happened in the background of her childhood. Her father was the whole foreground. She was 17 when she finally learned the truth about the drawing. It came out the way these things do, an old news clip surfacing. A classmate showing her a video from years back, and she came home one afternoon and stood in the kitchen and looked at the drawing on the refrigerator, the one that had hung there her whole life, with its tape and its white seam through the heart, and she understood all at once what she was looking at. "Dad," she said quietly. "The drawing. She tore it. That night. Didn't she?" Ethan looked up from the table. He'd known this day would come. He'd almost been relieved it hadn't come sooner. "Yeah," he said. "She did. And you never told me." Lily's eyes were filling up. "All these years, you let me think it was magic. You let me think it kept you safe." "It did keep me safe, sweetheart," Ethan said, and he stood up and he crossed the kitchen to his daughter, who was nearly as tall as he was now, who had her mother's eyes exactly. "You want to know the honest truth. That night when everything was falling apart, when 2,000 people were laughing at me, and I felt smaller than I've ever felt in my whole life, I had your drawing in my pocket. And I kept thinking about you making it. Tongue poking out the side of your mouth, using up the whole red crayon. And it was the only thing in that whole room that felt real." He put his hands on her shoulders. "So yes, she tore it. And yes, I taped it back together. But it kept me safe just the same, because it reminded me what I was standing up for. It was never about the company, Lily. It was never about the money or the shares or any of it. It was about coming home to you. That's the only reason I stood up straight in that room. That drawing did exactly what you made it to do." Basimabti. Lily Carter threw her arms around her father and cried into his shoulder the way she had when she was 7, and Ethan held his daughter in the kitchen of the small house he'd never let go of, under the taped-together drawing that had hung there for 10 years. And he thought about Sarah the way he did every single day, and he told her silently the thing he'd been telling her for a decade. "I kept my promise. Nobody ever made her feel small. Not one day of her life. I kept it, Sarah. I kept every word of it." She went off to college 2 years later, and she came back, changed the way they all do, full of ideas and arguments and a fierce certainty about the world. And one night over dinner, she told her father she'd figured out what she wanted to do with her life. "I want to run it someday," she said. "The company. Not because I have to, because I want to, because of what it stands for now, what you made it stand for." She looked at him. "That's yours and Mom's, both of you. I want to keep it going. Would that be okay?" And Ethan Carter set down his fork and he looked at his daughter across the same kitchen table where she'd once worn a red crayon down to a nub, and he had to take a moment before he could answer, because the whole long, strange road of his life seemed to arrive right then at exactly the place it had always been heading. "Your mother," he said, walked away from all of it, because she didn't want it to change who she was. And she was right to, and I'll never say a word against it, because if she hadn't, I'd never have met her, and you'd never have been born." He reached across the table and took his daughter's hand. But then, at the very end, she reached back and took it just long enough to hand it to you and me. And I always wondered why. Why take it after a whole life of running from it? And I think I finally understand. His voice went thick. She didn't take it for the money. She took it because she knew that someday there'd be a person good enough to run it right. She just wasn't sure it would be her. So she left it in a place where it could wait until the right person came along. He squeezed Lily's hand. And here you are. Yeah, sweetheart. That'd be more than okay. That'd be the thing your mother was hoping for the whole time. Ethan Carter ran the company for 11 more years, and then he handed it to his daughter, and he went home to the small house on the small street, and he grew old in it, and he was happy. Baby. And on the last day, years and years later, when his daughter sat by his bed, holding his hand, the way he'd once held her mother's, Lily Carter leaned close to her father and asked him if he was afraid. And Ethan Carter smiled, the same small tired smile he'd smiled at Victoria Ashford in a ballroom a lifetime ago. And he shook his head. No, baby, he said. I'm not afraid. I did the only thing that ever mattered. I came home. Every single time I came home. He closed his eyes. Tell your mother I kept my promise. She'll know the one. And somewhere in that small house on a refrigerator that had held it for a lifetime, taped down the middle with a white seam running through a red crayon heart, a child's drawing still said the truest thing anyone ever wrote about Ethan Carter. You are the strongest. He was. Not because he owned a company, not because he beat the woman who tried to destroy him, but because a man who had every reason in the world to become hard chose every single day of his life to stay soft, to stay kind, to stay the kind of man his little girl could run to at a school gate. And in the end, that is the only kind of strength that was ever worth having. That was Ethan Carter, the worker they laughed at, the father who came home, and no one ever called him just a worker again.